All right. Hello, everyone. Hopefully, you are having a great day today. We're back. Oh, man. I thought we were done for the year, but we're not done yet. Oh, my gosh. We still got like a week and a half left till the AP test. And so, I think I'm going to call this my Yappin series. Yes, yes, yes. These are going to be Mr. G Yap sessions about each of the time periods. But we're not gonna do it 1, 2, and 9. We're just gonna do 3 through 8. And again, like I talked about this in class, right? Like 3 through 8 is the meat of the test. This is where everything comes from. 85% of the test is gonna be about these time periods, right? So it doesn't make any sense to go to 1, 2, and 9 at this point, right? We got to cram as much as we can, try to remember these key dates, try to remember these key ideas, these key themes um, in each of the time periods, right? So we're going to start with time period 3 here. And time period 3 is like our revolutionary time period, right? We're starting off in the year 1754. And the reason why, again, College Board picks 1754 is because of the French and Indian War, right? Um, or the 7 Years' War. Any of those things you want to call that war, you call it either one, right? French and Indian, 7 years. Same thing. Now, here's the thing about the French and Indian War, um, 7 Years' War, and the reason why College Board chooses to start at this year, right? This is really the beginning of the end when Britain can just ignore what's happening with its colonies, right? In the Americas, uh, in what will become the United States at the end of the well, by the end of the time period, right? Um, and it's with this 7 Years' War, right? Because this 7 Years' War, you got to remember everything in this class. It always comes down to money, and wars cost money. And how do countries raise money? Through taxes, right? And so this war, I mean, it's not like it's a short war. I mean, it's called the 7 Years' War, but it lasts 9 years, right? It's a global conflict that's happening not only in the Americas, but also in Europe as well, right? There's conflict between the French and the British throughout the world as they're trying to build these global colonial superpowers. Um, but for our class, it's important to note that this is the beginning of the end when it comes to the relationship between the American colonies and the British, right? But we got a long way till we get to the end of that relationship, right? 1763 is 13 years away from 1776. There's a lot of stuff that happens in between in this quote unquote prelude to revolution, right? And I think you could break it into several parts of the revolution itself. So let's start with the prelude to revolution, right? So, French and Indian War, boom. The British win. They signed the Treaty of Paris. French are kicked out of North America. Awesome, right? Couple of things happened in the middle of this war, though, right? The main thing that you need to know is the Albany Plan of Union. And so this is the first time the colonists have come together, right? Well, most of them, and have this idea of forming this colonial style government, right? Which is huge in influencing what's going to happen later on. Ben Franklin, one of the guys you should know who pops up on the key concepts, right? Is the person who comes up with this Albany Plan of Union, right? Um, and so he kicks us off with these ideas, right? This idealism of breaking away from Britain, this new colonial government that we're trying to form. Now, as we're coming out of the French and Indian War and we're heading into 1763, it's a huge year, not just because of the treaty, but just because the French are gone doesn't mean the people that were already here are gone, right? Native Americans still live, exist, thrive in some areas throughout the American colonies, and definitely in the frontier and westward part of those colonies, right? And so in 1763, because of this constant pushing into Native American lands and territories, we see this rebellion, right? Pontiac's Rebellion in 1763, and it shows that Native Americans are tired of the British control. It shows that they're ready to push away. They don't want to be a part of this, right? And here's the thing: the British lose a fort, right? And of course, they're at war again, and wars cost money, right? So this is costing the British government money now. Again, they just finished fighting a 9 years war for these colonies. They need a little bit of return on investment before we get into a whole nother set of wars, right? So the British government comes out and tells the American colonists, you know what? We're going to establish this line, right? It's called the Royal Proclamation of 1763, or you could shorten it to the Proclamation Line of 1763, right? And this Proclamation Line of 1763 tells American colonists you cannot go westward past the Appalachian Mountains. Now, here's the thing: a lot of these colonists had just fought in this war, this 9 year war, for one thing, land opportunities to go westward. And so a lot of them are upset over this, right? It's like it's not a direct cause of the revolution, but it's one of those things as an example of how the British are trying to rein in control, right? And again, this is why we say that the French and Indian War, 7 Years' War, 1754, 1763, you got to know those dates because it marks the end of salutary neglect. The British can no longer just tell the colonies, do what you want, da da da. No, they got to pay for these things, right? And so before there were taxes in place, right? The British had taxes. They tried to do these things, but right, but you know what? Sometimes we're not going to collect them. We could cut from here, and there, right? This is before the French and Indian War. Afterwards, we start to see this increase in taxation, right? And we can start to see it with the Sugar Act in 1764. And the colonists are upset, right? Who wants to pay taxes? Come on. We all hate paying taxes. So we get the Sugar Act. Colonists are upset. Okay. Sugar Act comes and goes. Next year, Stamp Act. Oh, here we go again. Everyone's affected by the Stamp Act, right? All printed materials. Boom. Anything that requires a stamp. Now you got a tax on it. Psh, let's go protest, right? We start to see these protests break out. We see the colonists form the Stamp Act Congress to protest this whole Stamp Act business, and the British have to pull it back again, right? The British try to push that control in 1765 with the Quartering Act, right? Requiring the colonists to house British soldiers. Again, another financial burden on the colonists that they don't want. And so, again, we see this pushback, right? This pushback by the colonists, and then, British come and go with that. And then the next year in 1766, we get the Declaratory Acts, and it's another tax on the colonists after the repeal of the Stamp Act, right? Again, like the British are trying to pay off debts that they have, right? The Townshend Acts impose even more taxes on imported goods now, right? Again, colonists are upset. The boycotts, the protests are starting up in the streets, right? We start to see the daughters and sons of liberty and the revolution is coming, right? It's not fully started yet, but we're working towards it, right? These are all the prelude to revolution. And I think these are more indirect causes, right? Where the next set that we're talking about here, these are the direct causes of revolution, right? These key dates, these key events that lead us into this, like, there's no point of return after this, right? One of those things happens, like the very first thing I think happens in 1770 with the Boston Massacre, right? The Boston Massacre, it happens, you guessed it, in Boston. There's colonists yelling at British soldiers, throwing snowballs at them. Some of them have rocks inside. One guy gets hit on the British side of things. It causes the musket to go off. They think the colonists are shooting at them, and they shoot into the crowd of colonists, and they kill 5 people. right? It's the first blood that's been spilt of this revolution. We're still 6 years away from 1776, but this really starts to change the hearts and minds of the American colonists, right? 1773, what do British people love to drink? Tea. What are the American colonists? British. Again, this Tea Act is passed, another tax that affects the vast majority of British subjects in the American colonies. They're upset. They protest. Protests get a little bit crazy. We have the Boston Tea Party, right? Where they start to throw the tea into the harbor. And so again, we can see these this aggressive action taking place, right? The British are not happy about this. And so in order to punish the colonists, we get the Intolerable Acts of 1774. Close off Boston Harbor, take away the self-governance that exists in the American colonies, right? From the North New England area especially. Colonists are upset again, right? This time, so much so that in 1774, we see the first Continental Congress, right? Where all the colonies come together, or not all of them, but most of them send representatives to come together to tell the British to back off, right? As this new response to what's happening in this era where salutary neglect no longer exists, right? This is the era of no taxation without representation. Look at what they lost in 1774, right? So as we head out of 1774, we head into 1775. We have the Declaration of Causes and Necessities, right? Now we're at the point to where people are like, we need to go to war, right? The revolution is here. We need to do something, right? And so the colonists start to have these conversations about arming themselves and getting ready for the war at hand, right? In 1775, they decide to send an olive branch to King George and tell him, hey man, we're loyal to you. We want to be part of this whole British Empire thing. Let us have a voice, right? Let us be involved in Parliament. And of course, King George laughs it off, right? Doesn't do anything to change what's happened. And there's again this battle cry of the revolution: no taxation without representation. This is where that comes from, guys, right? And as we head out of 1775 and head into 1776, things become even more heated than what they already were. Right? Another person that pops up directly in the key concepts is Thomas Paine, and he writes Common Sense. And Common Sense is a pamphlet series that comes out and urges that the colonists must fight for revolution, they must fight for independence, they must fight for this new idea of republicanism, and a new form of government must be established by these American colonists. Right? And by 1776, July 4th, Thomas Jefferson puts pen to paper and writes the document that starts the revolution. Right? July 4th, 1776, the Declaration of Independence becomes known to the world. Right? Second Continental Congress came together, approved it, boom. What do they use? Enlightenment ideals. Right? These ideas of natural rights, this idea of life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, they got it from somewhere. It came from the Enlightenment, it came from the ideas of John Locke and Rousseau. It's not like they just came up with it on their own, right? And within this Declaration of Independence, they tell the Crown what they've done wrong, why they are wanting to be a new independent nation, and we've kicked off the American Revolution. Right? Now, College Board decides to just like skip over the revolution. I think it's important to know that there's still loyalists here. That's probably the most important thing to know. The revolution is fought from 1776 to 1783. Of course, the American colonies win and form eventually the United States of America. But we have a new nation, right? And I think this is one of my DBQ predictions, right? You're going to see this. This is, if I were College Board, I think this is going to be, I really think this is my number one, right? I think this is where the DBQ is going to come from. And it's going to be about the way that government changes over time. I think they could go all the way back to 1776 and run it all the way to 1800, right? And so as we develop this new idea, this new nation, right? What do? We got to have a founding document, right? But that founding document, it can't be too innovative, right? It has to keep the colonies together. It has to keep everyone on the same page. And so they passed this new thing, right? And this new thing's called the Articles of Confederation. And they establish a weak federal government. Remember, we're coming out of a monarchy, right? We're afraid of what's happening with too much centralized control. And so what do? We run to the exact opposite, right? And we create this decentralized federal government. And as 1783 rolls around and the Treaty of Paris is signed and the Revolutionary War officially ends and America has its independence, these Articles of Confederation start to show that maybe this wasn't the best idea for having a republic of states, right? Because the Articles of Confederation, what they do is they create the Justice League of states, right? It's not really like a truly united thing. Like it's not like Avengers Assemble, right? It's more like we're doing our thing, you do your thing. Every once in a while we'll come together and agree on one thing and we'll do that together, and that's it, right? It's like the Justice League. They don't ever bring the whole Justice League together, and when they did, it was terrible. It's Articles of Confederation, same thing, right? There are a couple of good things that come out of the Articles of Confederation. The two to know, well, there's really one big one you should absolutely know, but one of the things that's probably like that footnote of history is the Land Ordinance of 1785, which is important to establishing this idea of public education and land sales in the Northwest Territories. But I think the more important one to know is in 1787, the Northwest Ordinance, right? And the Northwest Ordinance is huge, and definitely the 1785 Land Ordinance is needed for the Northwest Ordinance to happen in the first place, right? Of course. But the Northwest Ordinance decides how we're going to form our new states, right? Again, it goes into this crafting of a new nation. And again, this is the one bright spot of the Articles of Confederation is the Northwest Ordinance. And it establishes those guidelines for what these new territories have to do to eventually become states. And it also establishes that we're getting rid of slavery in these Northwest territories, right? Which is huge because, like, dude, slavery existed top to bottom, right, throughout the American colonies. Now we're questioning this institution, right? Especially in these Northwest territories. And so it's showing the early starts of slight abolitionism to an extent, right? Not to a great extent, but to somewhat extent, we can see this questioning happening at least, right? As we move further into 1787, we realize why the Articles of Confederation are terrible, right? So there's this episode that happens in, you guessed it, Massachusetts. It's always Massachusetts in the colonial area, right? Massachusetts decides, or not Massachusetts decides, but there's farmers in this state, right? And those farmers were promised pension checks, but they need the money now, right? They're in debt. They're in threat of going to prison. They need the money. But the government can't pay it out, right? Because the government can't raise funds. There's no unified currency. Like, it can't do anything, right? So even if the government wanted to pay these pension checks, they couldn't. And so these farmers in Massachusetts freak out because they're like, dude, we just fought this war over taxation, and now I'm losing my farm. I'm losing everything to taxes. What do you mean? What are you talking about? And as more and more farmers get sent into this debtor's prison, it sets off this series of events that leads us into Shays' Rebellion, right? And so we get this Shays' Rebellion in 1787 that exposes the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. Heck, we couldn't even have a standing army to go and fight off these guys. The state of Massachusetts had to rise up a militia to fight it off. That's crazy, right? The federal government couldn't even help one of its states. What are we doing? And so, as we move further into 1787, we realize that this has to change, right? This cannot stay the same any longer. And guess what? I was invited to the Constitutional Convention because we get a Constitutional Convention in 1787. And the Constitution's written, it's drawn out, it creates a very strong centralized federal government, but within that federal government, there's a separation of powers. There's a legislative branch, there's a judicial branch, there's an executive branch, right? And within those separation of powers, there's a system of checks and balances to make sure that not any one part of government has too much power, right? And there's a series of compromises that also happen with the Constitution, right? Of course, the Great Compromise, the whole idea of how we're setting up our legislature, the bicameral House, where you have the House of Representatives, which is based off population. You have the Senate, which is based off, hey, no matter what, if you're a state, you get 2 representatives. Again, that whole idea of checks and balances, separation of powers. You see the 3/5 compromise as well, the issue of slavery and representation and whether slaves should be counted within the total population. We decide that for every 5 slaves, that equals 3 people for representation, right? Which the South is happy with. And so we have all these things happening. There's a Fugitive Slave Act within the Constitution as well, making sure that slavery is codified within the Constitution, realizing that, hey, runaways aren't going to be allowed, all this stuff, right? So we work our way out of 1787, finally gets ratified in 1789. With that, we also see a Bill of Rights added to it because the anti-federalist side, right? The federalists are the guys that want the Constitution, that want the strong federal government. The anti-federalists are like, whoa, whoa, whoa. This is too strong of a central government. This is too much power. What's going to happen to individual rights? What's going to happen to individual liberties? And the government can just come in and take away stuff. No. Right? And so we get this Bill of Rights, which are the first 10 amendments of the Constitution to establish these individual liberties and rights that we all have as Americans, right? Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom to protest. All of those things come from these Bill of Rights, right? And so as we're coming out, and George Washington's our first president right off the gate, we see this big problem happen, the Whiskey Rebellion, and, farmers are upset because they're being taxed at a higher rate now, and so they don't want to pay the tax, but the federal government now has the ability to mobilize. And so George Washington goes down there and puts down their little rebellion, and it's done. And the Whiskey Rebellion shows, right? Look at the progress we made from Shays to whiskey, right? Where Shays, the federal government, just had to sit there on the sideline with the whiskey. They're taking charge, right? And so, there's other stuff that happens within the time period as well. Like you could talk about how, George Washington's farewell address is huge, right? This whole idea of like, hey, maybe we shouldn't have political parties. We'll talk about that in a bit. The whole idea that, hey, maybe we should stay out of foreign affairs, right? All of these things are happening. John Adams comes in and replaces George Washington. Of course, John Adams famously has to deal with things like the XYZ affair, where we're getting questioned about our national sovereignty. He'll pass the Alien and Sedition Acts because people are talking bad about him. But Washington and Adams are Federalists. There's a guy by the name of Thomas Jefferson from Virginia that's ready to run for president by the time we get to 1800, and he's going to win. And the thing about him is that he's not a Federalist. He's an anti-Federalist, or what we would refer to now, right, in the time period as a Democratic Republican, right? And so we have this stuff going on, right? These key events, these key the key events of period 3. The big ideas, though, that you definitely should be focusing on, right, are these ideas of colonial resistance and self-government at the beginning of the time period, right? This whole idea of this tension existing between the American colonies and the British, it's not something that happened overnight, right? It was a build-up to it. And so as there's this constant back and forth with the British, we see more of this desire for self-governance amongst the colonies, right? There's also the concept that, hey, if we're being taxed, we should also be represented as well. How is that fair, right? Of course, the impact of the war on colonial unity. When we talk about the war, we're talking about the 7 Years' War. Again, the Albany Plan of Union. This shows that the colonists are united as one, but not everyone goes, right? There's some regional differences that are developing already before the United States is even the United States. Of course, the conflict with Native Americans is going to be always a central issue for the colonists moving forward. And part of the reason why colonists aren't too happy with the British as they're trying to push westward, right? Of course, the influence of Enlightenment ideals is huge, especially for the Declaration of Independence. Like I said, John Locke and Rousseau, the ideas of natural rights, social contract theory, all influence the founding documents of America, right? And they come from the Enlightenment period. There's this new American identity that's forming that is separating slowly but surely over time from the British, right? And again, it starts with events like the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, huge pivotal moments in history that are shaping the whole of the colonists, right? And how they think about things and how they want to operate and do things as well. Of course, the government formation from the Articles of Confederation being weak to the strong centralized government that the Constitution provides us with. There's some major social changes happening as well. Women are not receiving rights. They're not included in the Constitution by any means. But there is this idea of Republican motherhood, right? And Republican motherhood is just this idea that women have this duty and they have this like social power to raise good American sons and daughters with American ideals, right? We also see more of this discussion about equality and rights amongst the American colonists and eventually the American people. There's this constant fighting over land and resources, right? In the Americas, in the United States, when it becomes the United States, between Native Americans and Europeans that exist out west already, right? There's going to be constant conflicts over these things. Yeah, it's just you know, it's constant. And last but not least, of course, is the political factions that begin to develop. So, despite George Washington's warning in his farewell address, we decide that, hey, you know what? It's actually better if we do form political parties. And so, by the time we get to the election of 1800, we got two political parties, right? The Federalists, which are the strong centralized government people, and the Democratic Republicans, who are more like, hey, let's follow the Constitution strictly. Um, they have a very different view of how things should be operating and working, right? And we'll get more into how those views are going to evolve over time in time period 4, right? Because this time period 3, ends with 1800, which is the election of 1800, which is also referred to as the Revolution of 1800, where we see this bloodless transition of power from one party to the next. Um, of course, the National Bank is going to be an issue, right? For all my Hamilton fans out there, you already know this, right? About the National Bank, Alexander Hamilton versus Jefferson. Jefferson resigns from George Washington's cabinet. Um, you know, they don't agree on it. Jefferson doesn't think the idea of a national bank is one necessary or one good for the people, while Alexander Hamilton fights for it, right? Um, and yeah, that's what we got going on in time period number 3 from 1754 to 1800. So hopefully you enjoyed this yap session. Hopefully you watched it on 2x speed. I don't know. I'm kind of quick, so it might not work as good on 2x. You might want to try 1.25 or 1.5. 2x might be too fast because I know I tend to talk really quick through these. But no, guys, I hope y'all have a great day. This is the first one, period 3. We got 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 5 more of these to go. But y'all have a great day when you are watching this. Study, study, study. We got this. We're almost there, guys. So close to the end. Bye, everybody.